it's a strange breed of car because it has four-wheel brakes. Cars in that era didn't really have four-wheel brakes, so this was sort of like an upmarket car. The Pontiac that came at the same time only had two-wheel brakes, and that's how they cut back on cost. So it was a car ahead of its time. Hi, my name's Noel Mackey. This is my 1927 Oakland Roadster. Purchased it recently, and I'm going to tell you a bit about it. The Oakland came about because I've got two grandsons. One's called Riley, the other one's called Hudson, and we managed to find a 1926 Hudson for one of my grandsons, who's only 8. And on that farm at the time, a couple of years ago, was this particular Oakland Roadster, and the gentleman didn't want to sell it at the time, but I told him if he ever did in the future, let me know. And about 2 years later he rang me and said he wanted to get rid of it, and because I've always wanted to own a Roadster since I was very young, I bought it and we got it here. And believe it or not, this thing's in original condition. Everything on it is just crazy, in perfect condition. Not perfect, but for its age it's perfect. And I was shocked and surprised how good a condition it was, considering I've looked at these things for the last 60 odd years, and I've never seen one in any condition like this, in an original shape. Check the fuel. It does have a fuel gauge, but it's hidden under the panel work, so you can't see it. So I use my famous dipstick method, and yes, we have half a tank of fuel, so we can go for a drive. The door, open the door, climb in very carefully without hurting myself. We're actually starting. Ignition on. This all started for me when I was very young, and I was probably around about 10 years old, when my dad was involved in rebuilding old cars for people and repairing the timber work in old cars. And at the same time, other friends of my dad's were involved in the local hot rod club, and the hot rods back then were probably totally different to now in the way they're built, but they were all hand built at home, not pre-purchased parts and assembled like they are now. So that's where I got my starting point. That's where I grew up with, and I grew up with a friend that had a 1928 Pontiac Roadster, and I can't believe the coincidences as years have gone on. His 1928 Pontiac Roadster is the car that came after the Oakland. Oakland were originally owned by General Motors, and they only made Oaklands to about 1933. And in 1927 they introduced the Pontiac, and the Pontiac was an identical car to the Oakland, except it was a cheaper version. Thinner metals, narrower chassis, less nuts and bolts, all that sort of stuff. It was just a cheaper running version. But the coincidence was that what I've ended up with at the end of my life is an Oakland, which is the pre-runner to the car that started me off, which was a 1928 Pontiac Roadster hot rod. So that, I find that an incredible coincidence. As a kid, I was so involved in cars. We had so many cars that used to come around home. Dad used to repair them. The guys used to come around just for coffee and beer and repair them at home, because we had a little bit more room than what they did probably. And so that's where it all kicked off for me. Aside from that, the first car I ever rebuilt was a Morris Minor. It was a 1948 that we upgraded to about a 1953 Morris Minor. We bought it for my sister for, I think it was about $10 or something at the time, and but it was just a body shell. There was no mud guards, there was no windows, there was no dashboard. It was just a body shell, and it was a rust-free body shell. So Dad said, okay, well let's build a car for my sister, who was 2 years older than me, ready for her when she turned 17. So I think that was about when I was 12 years old. We got that, and in 2 years Dad and I totally rebuilt that car and got it registered, and she had it for a little while, and then I drove it around for a couple of years and then on-sold it. And that's where I learnt mechanics. I learnt electricals because I had to. I rewired the car myself when I was 13 years old. Never ever done that before, but I just followed the principle of my dad being a plumber. I understood water flow and hydraulics. So my brain went down that path when I was doing electrics back then. And I figured water's the same as power. And it only flows in one direction usually, and there's things that stop it and make it work and change directions. So that's how my brain ended up being pretty good at electrics, because through cross-referencing it to early plumbing. Sounds crazy, but you know, I am probably a bit crazy. that's enough about me and my trivial life. We step back to the Oakland. It was truly amazing to go out to the farm out the back of Toowoomba and see this car. The gentleman said at the time when I first saw it that it was running and going, so I believed him, and I just bought it over the phone and went out there with the trailer with one of my sons. We loaded it up, we started it up, drove it onto the trailer, drove back here and parked down the bottom of the driveway and drove it up the hill and parked where it is now. I've been over the whole car, and truly it's just something here needs tightening or that needs adjusting, and it's just been amazing that it goes. The main thing I've had to do is I had to meticulously rebuild the carburetor, because the carburetor was old and all the brass bits were cracked, and it was a task and a half, but I got it back to being pretty well perfect. And that's been the main thing that makes the car run and reliable. The Oakland, it's a strange breed of car because it has four-wheel brakes. Cars in that era didn't really have four-wheel brakes, so this was sort of like an upmarket car. The Pontiac that came at the same time only had two-wheel brakes, and that's how they cut back on cost. So it was a car ahead of its time. It was a 3-speed transmission, obviously no synchromesh, outboard brakes and wooden spoke wheels. Even the wooden spoke wheels are still in their original state, and there's no movement in any of those either. It's just amazing. The only thing that I've planned on doing to the car is doing the seat, reupholstering the seat, because the seat's pretty ordinary. The previous people did a very, very, very temporary repair, and that's the only thing really that I'm going to do for one of the other major things I did actually was I had to rebuild the speedo, because the speedo was all swollen. For anyone that's interested in old dashboard gauges, any 20s, 30s alloys swell and crack and break. It's just what happens, and so you've got to rebuild them or change them to something else to make it work. So I just changed this one out, and that's all I've done. So it's what it is. It's not the original paint. Believe it or not, I've found a bit of history on it. A doctor in Gympie apparently owned it originally, and it was his car for going around seeing his patients and obviously going to church on Sundays. And that's where it originated from. The history in between is very skeptical, but that's obviously where it started from. original colour, there was a spot on the car, and I think it was like a green, a really dark greeny blue, and it had yellow pinstriping everywhere. There's a couple of little signs of that, and the story is that this car, they wanted to repaint it because the paint got really bad, the original, and the bloke that did it many years ago, about 40 years ago, decided to paint it with house paint, and that's basically what you're seeing there now. But it's how it is. There's no cracks in any of the panels. There's a few things are loose, but it's the original radiator. It's quite amazing. It truly is amazing, and I'm really happy that I've got it, and looking forward to being able to just drive it down for a cup of coffee every now and again, and take the wife and some of the grandkids for a run, and give them an experience of what it's like to drive an old car. It's truly amazing when you go somewhere for a drive. I don't take it for big drives, but you drive down the road and people stop and stare, point, kids wave. It's really exciting to see people get involved in something as you're driving it down the road. Unfortunately, when I park it somewhere, it's like bees to a honey hive. It just gathers people around like crazy, and I can understand why, but I think it's just the fact that it looks so old. Most people can't believe that it's actually running and going. So that's quite an interesting thing that happens when you take it out for a drive. It's also amazing how many people say, their grandfather or their uncle or somebody else owned one of these many years ago, which is pretty rare, because considering these things haven't been built since 1933, the name brand, not many people know about it. Even Department of Transport don't even know about it, because they don't even have it listed on their registration names. So it's interesting when people say my uncle or grandfather or whatever had one, and I try and bleed them for information if they've got any, but most people don't. So unfortunately, it's like any old car, you're on your own when you go to do anything with it. But no, I'm enjoying it at this stage of my life. I'll be happy to pass it on to members of my family at a later stage, and hopefully somewhere down the track we'll still have fossil fuel, and this thing will be running. If not, someone will convert it to electric and keep it going.